It's better to have 100 users that love you than a million users that kind of like you, right? Like you need to have evangelists, people who feel really passionate about what you do.
Nathan Blecharczyk is the co-founder of Airbnb, which is a platform that redefined how we travel, how we connect, the way we create experiences, how we experience the world, with millions of hosts and guests across 220 countries, valued at around $75 billion today.
A whole year has gone by. Our actual business isn't making any money. It's not growing despite all the work we're doing. We are having trouble paying our rent again. When do you quit?
When do you quit? Why continue?
So we made an agreement. And this in itself is a pretty interesting story and a lesson.
So take us back in time. You've been tinkering with code, building things from a very young age. How did that shape you? Take us back in time a little bit.
Yeah, I got started at a very young age. Many young people, I was into playing computer games and such. And one day at the age of 12, I was homesick from school. And my dad is an electrical engineer, and he had books about computers. This is like the mid 90s right now. So, computers are still kind of newish. Internet's definitely new. Anyways, I start looking through his books and start learning how to write simple scripts based on these books. And I was interested in that because it was relevant for playing my games. Out of that, though, that Christmas, I asked for a programming book. And I got one that was, basically how to program in 21 days. And it's a 500-page book. I actually managed to complete it in about 30 days, while also, going to school and doing other things. So I devoured the book. And from there on, I just kept going to the bookstore at that time, Barnes and Noble, and buying more computer books. Oftentimes, 500-page books, reference books that were probably not meant to be read from front to back, and probably not by a kid. But I
Definitely
was
not
just
my
super
team.
curious and hungry. So I was teaching myself how to code. It became a hobby of mine. I was posting my work on the internet. I said, if you like my work, please send me $5. Nobody ever sent me $5. But better yet, at the age of 14, I got a phone call. So a couple of years later, I got a phone call. It was a guy who said, I saw your work on the internet and I would like to pay you $1,000 to make something similar for me. So I'm excited. I tell my dad, hey, somebody from the internet wants to pay me $1,000. And he's like, son, nobody from the internet's going to pay you $1,000. I mean, this is the mid 90s, so this is
It
all very
sounds
novel.
weird. It sounds like a
It
fraud,
sounds like a
Nathan.
scam, right? Totally. Right. It still sounds like a scam. It sounded like one back then too. But I said, whatever, dad, this is my hobby. I'll do it just for fun and we'll see what happens. So I did the work. And sure enough, 30 days later, I got paid, which was pretty cool. But better yet, I got introductions to other people who needed similar things made. And so this began kind of like a consulting business where I was writing code for contract. And then I kind of had an aha moment where I said, it feels like people are asking me to write the same thing for them. Like instead of creating a bespoke product for each person and reinventing the wheel, why don't I just create a software product and sell licenses to it? And so
Amazing.
this began a business that I ran throughout high school for about 4 or 5 years.
Before that, Nathan, were you exposed to entrepreneurship? As far as I'm concerned, I was in Intel at the time, and entrepreneurship, even the word didn't exist. Were you exposed to that? Were you inspired by anything?
Yeah, I think ultimately my parents and my dad in particular kind of instilled the key ingredients. It wasn't by the name of entrepreneurship, but he taught me definitely a few things. I mentioned he was an electrical engineer, but one taught me to be curious. Like he was always bringing home stuff from work for me to take apart and tinker with. And he's very much about you can teach yourself anything. You can just go to the library, get a book. He never hired anyone in his life, I think, to do anything for him. He's a very handyman.
That's amazing.
And yeah, I think just kind of a work ethic as well, work hard. So yeah, I think this kind of, led me towards the entrepreneurship journey.
So then you have a consulting at age as a teen. So where did that go, Nathan?
Right. So I started off as consulting, became a software business selling licenses to products, made almost $1 million basically in high
Unbelievable.
school. And it was just me, really. I didn't have any employees. I had a few software products I was selling. More important, though, than the money was kind of the lessons that imparted on me. I mean, one, I taught myself all the skills. So that gave me confidence that I could just, learn whatever I needed to know on my own. And then second was simply that I could do things that other people valued, and I'm like a
Right.
teenager. So you don't necessarily think of yourself as an adult or capable of that. And yet I was doing it and I was getting a lot of positive feedback. And so that was just fuel for the fire. And out of that, I think came my my love for entrepreneurship. The satisfaction
Unbelievable.
of building something for someone gave me a taste of entrepreneurship, and that's when I became, effectively a lifelong entrepreneur.
Which is interesting because also as a teen, when you make so much money, you could also decide that maybe you want to get lazy. But it sounds like that was not in your books. But tell me, so what happened next? So you have this like business. How did you get into Airbnb and how did that start?
A few things happened there. So, like, I started this in high school, then I went to college. I went to Harvard. The first year was actually pretty easy, but my second year got pretty hard. And in the second year, I made a decision to shut down my business. Actually, I know some people drop out of school and pursue the business. Many of my peers have done that, but for me, I thought, you know what, like this is an experience I want to have. It's a period of my life. I'm going to do this, and there'll always be other entrepreneurial
Amazing.
opportunities in the future. And so I actually shut down my business, focused on having the college experience for those 4 years, and then it was a question of like, well, what do I do after college? And
Right.
I ended up getting kind of what I'll call a normal software engineering job at like a mid-sized company. That might sound surprising, given my entrepreneurial activity. They had come recruiting on campus, and the kind of work they were doing fit some of my academic interests. So I thought it was cool and interesting. And so I went with it. And I thought, this will give me like just another perspective that will presumably be valuable. I don't have to do it forever. Well, it
Right.
ended up being very short-lived. I only stayed there for about 7 months. By the time I showed up, which was like 5 months after I interviewed, a few months after graduating, by the time I showed up, they needed me to do something completely different than what they had sold me on. So that was a little disappointing. And it turned out that the pace of what they were doing was very slow. And I just found myself, being bored and not really engaged with it. It wasn't stimulating for me. And I went to quit, and my boss said, "Oh, you can't quit. You're our most productive engineer." And that was really funny slash alarming to me, because actually what was happening was I had an office all to myself, and I only had one meeting a week. So for the most part, nobody knew what I was doing in the office. My routine was I'd come in and I'd code the first half of the day. The second half of the day, I'd be like trading stocks, reading blogs, not working effectively. And then to be told that you're the like most productive engineer, that
That's
was
scary for
concerning.
a high achiever.
And I think it reinforced the point, yeah, that I was not being challenged. I was not growing. I wasn't gaining skills that I thought was going to further my career or my entrepreneurial ambitions. And so I
Right.
quickly made the choice to leave. And I think that's a really important, just general lesson. Like, I don't think there's any wrong career choice as long as you learn in the process and you're being stimulated, and that you make the decision when it stops becoming challenging, it stops becoming interesting. That's when you move on. And so that's what I did next.
But that's also very brave, Nathan, right? Because I mean, I don't know. I mean, you're young, but you still have a salary. Was it scary?
I had just a lot of confidence in my ability, so I always knew that I could always get a job, if and when I
Right.
needed one, and I could also do consulting. I had also saved a bunch of my money from my high school business. I did not go and spend much of it at all. I had some cushion there to allow me to take risk, and then I also just had confidence too.
So you quit. Yeah. What happened?
I quit, and at this point, I had grown up in Boston. I went to this job that was in the greater Washington D.C. area. So I'd been on the East Coast exclusively, and I made the decision that it was time to go west. It was time to go find other people like myself, because especially back then, I found not a lot of people like me, not a lot of entrepreneurial tech
Right.
people in Boston or even DC at that time. It's different now, but back then I really
Right.
felt alone. All my friends from Harvard were going off to medical school, law school, business school, getting high paying jobs. They'd ask, "Hey, Nate, what are you doing?" And I'd say, "I'm working on my projects." And they'd be like, you just kind of get, it would kind of like be a dead conversation.
Right.
That, they didn't understand that. And
Yeah.
so you felt a little out of place.
And Silicon Valley definitely had it. Yeah, I definitely had the bug.
It's the opposite. There everybody's an entrepreneur, which means
Right.
they're quitting their jobs and pursuing their passion, and that's like, that's the cool thing to do. It's not to go down a more traditional path.
Yeah.
And so I went to the West Coast to try to find people like myself.
What year was that?
This is 2007,
Okay.
2007, and so through a friend of a friend, I got connected to a startup opportunity. This is not Airbnb. This is something else. I like to say from this opportunity, I learned everything not to do when starting a company, which is actually super valuable.
It is.
experience. I mean, it was definitely stressful, but it was super, super valuable.
Give me an example. What were like a lesson that you decided to take with you?
Well, I think the most obvious thing is being overly confident in your business outcome, right? This was a company
Yeah,
that they just were so confident that they were going to make $7 million in their first year that they could therefore afford to spend any sum of money in order to just move faster. And
got
of
it.
course, I know of very few, if any, people who in the span of 12 months made $7 million when starting a company from scratch.
Right.
That's not how
It
it works. It
doesn't
takes
have, yeah.
longer. And so, they just ultimately ran out of runway. But when I
Mm,
joined, I was joining as an engineer. As soon as I joined, the two lead engineers quit. That probably should have been a warning sign. They had already seen enough. But it ended up being a really great opportunity for me nonetheless, because I got to step in and work with the founders to take their big vision, distill it down into a product
right.
specification, hire an engineering team, and go build it all in the span of 11 months. So it was a highly concentrated learning experience that didn't end the way that I had hoped, but also didn't necessarily negatively impact me, minus, the sense that I
Right.
had put a lot of effort in.
But it's also the first kind of management role that you had, right? I mean, it's kind of like it when we're
It was a lot
younger.
of
I mean, it's
responsibility. It was a
yeah,
lot of responsibility, and it included hiring people for sure.
and a lot
And
of
I learned
learning.
a lot of skills
Yeah,
that were then relevant to Airbnb, which is
exactly.
what comes next at this point. So
Yeah,
when I moved to San Francisco in 2007, I of course need a place to live. So I go on Craigslist and I find a roommate. And through Craigslist, I find Joe Gebbia, who later became one of the co-founders. But he had a apartment in south of Market, San Francisco, that looked nice. So I applied and showed up, and I actually got a call the next day, and he said, "Oh, sorry, but we gave it to somebody else. There was another designer that we really liked, and so we're sorry we can't offer you the room." So I was bummed, but actually then like a few days go by, and the person they had chosen, that Joe had chosen, fell through and backed out. And so Joe called me back and said, "Hey, would you like the room?" And I said, "Oh yes, I'm still interested." So he and I became roommates, living in San
amazing.
Francisco together for quite a few months. And during this time, we made some important observations about each other. One, after working on the weekends, we would come home and work on our passion projects. We had a lot of things we were into, and we would just work hard on them late into the night. And so we saw in each other a passion and a shared work ethic. And then second, we realized we had complementary skill sets. Joe is a designer by background. I'm an engineer by background, software engineer. So we started helping each other with our projects because we had complementary
Right.
skill sets. I was building websites for him. He was building UIs and marketing material for me. We saw the power of putting different skill sets together and what we could build when you do that.
Right.
So, those were two observations that really led to the creation of the company because,
And maybe I'll jump in when you say observations, the work ethics is, basically like working your asses off. Like you guys worked all day, all night. Am I understanding correctly?
yeah, exactly, exactly.
Okay. Okay.
But I think, choosing your
Yeah,
co-founders or
that's
business
important.
partners is such a high risk thing. It's a professional marriage,
Yeah.
and so many companies fall apart because the founding team breaks up. We had the opportunity to be friends, be roommates, observe each other's habits before getting serious about doing a
Which is
business venture
incredible.
together. And so, yeah, I think it gave us a lot of confidence that we'd make a good team.
When are we
The
starting to
aha moment,
rent Airbnb?
the aha moment, right,
Yeah.
is leading up to October 2007. The rent on our apartment is raised 25%. And I say, that's too expensive. I'm moving out. And another one of the roommates moved out, but Joe wanted to stay in the apartment, but he had quit his job to become an entrepreneur, also known as unemployed. So he didn't have the money to pay the increased rent either, but he wanted to stay. He calls up Brian, our other co-founder and CEO, and Brian and Joe had gone to Rhode Island School of Design together. So they were good friends from back then. Brian had been living in Los Angeles, working a more traditional job. And, Joe gives him a pep talk about, quitting his job to become an entrepreneur and joining him in San Francisco for, an adventure of entrepreneurship. So Brian gets inspired, quits his job, moves to San Francisco, I think without asking the cost of the rent. That whole part was I think not spoken about until he showed up. And now there's two of them, and they're realizing they still don't have the money to pay the rent. And so they're both designers by background, and they noticed that an international design conference was coming to San Francisco, and they noticed that all the hotels were sold out. And so they had this idea, why not take the extra bedroom, the bedroom that I had vacated, and rent it to designers who might need a place to stay that one weekend as a way to make some extra money. Now, this room is completely empty. It doesn't even have a bed, but Joe sets up an airbed. And instead of calling it a bed and breakfast, he calls it an AirBed and breakfast. So Airbnb is short for airbed and breakfast. They create a simple blog advertising the room and the airbed, and they're expecting guys like themselves. So 25-year-old, male probably. And instead they get a father of 4 from Utah, a man from India, and a 35-year-old woman from Boston. So like eclectic group. These guests get an affordable place to stay when hotels are otherwise sold out. And Joe and Brian make, I think, like $80 a night, times, I think, 3 or maybe 4 nights times 3 people. So almost $1,000. And they all go to the conference together and have a really great time. And Joe and Brian introduce them to their friends and they get meals. So it's really actually a whole experience that created an immense connection. And it was really just meant to be a one weekend way to raise a couple extra bucks. But one of the guests a month later checked in and said, like, hey, that was so much fun. Like, what are you doing next with Airbed and breakfast? And they're like, well, nothing. Like, there was just a one-time thing. And he's like, no, 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 no. That was too cool to walk away from. You should do something more there. In parallel to this, the three of us had been brainstorming. At this point, I had now quit my job. So now 3 of us are unemployed, all wanting to be entrepreneurs, all wanting to work together. And for 2 months, we were brainstorming ideas of what we could do together. And we had some ideas around like a roommate matching service or something like that that seemed relevant to what we had just recently gone through trying to find roommates. We went for 2 months brainstorming ideas without ever talking about the story that I just shared with you.
Wow, that's
That's like how
impressive.
it's like so obvious in retrospect that like one thing led to another, but in the moment, it
It
was sitting
wasn't
underneath our
nothing.
noses, and for 2 months, we didn't even realize it. It wasn't until we got that call from the guests encouraging Joe and Brian to kind of take the idea forward that they then shared it with me, and the 3 of us got enthused to go make it possible to book a home just as
Right.
easy as a hotel all around the world, and that's what we set off to do in early 2008.
And that's incredible, Nathan. So first of all, I love that you shared the story, that it wasn't as obvious, right? Because I think sometimes we, especially the high achievers, the driven, we want to tick all the boxes. We want all the evidence up front. The evidence is not there because you didn't get there yet, right? So I love that you share that. But from that moment, like you get this idea, but initially everybody thinks it's crazy. And I was in Silicon Valley at that time. Like everybody was just like, there's no way on earth that somebody will stay with a stranger in the house or let a stranger in the house. Like it's just absolutely not possible. So what made you continue to try, right? Like because you guys go to investors. Tell us a little bit about that beginning.
Yeah, well, a few things. I think one, we knew the 3 of us wanted to work together on something, right? And then this happened to be the idea, and the story was, pretty awesome. And
Right.
so it seemed like a cool enough thing to work on. Now, I at the time did not think this was going to be a big idea. I actually famously like wrote a like end of year note, which I would do every year to all my friends, and I described all the things I was working on, and this was like in the footnote as something that was like kind of fun, but probably not a big deal, you know. Much to the chagrin of Joe and Brian, who also got the letter, did not appreciate that characterization of our serious effort. I have to be honest, I was also a little cautious about jumping in at this point because I felt like I had a lot of opportunities. As an engineer, I had like
Right.
skills that were very much in demand. So there's like a high opportunity cost
Right.
with what else could I be doing? And it's very easy to be tempted, like, should I go work for this company, get paid a lot of money, or I have like 3 other ideas I'm working on. Like which
Right.
where do you focus and what do you double down on? I was partnering with 2 designers, and on the one hand, they had complementary skills, so that was compelling. On the other hand, I felt a little outnumbered, right? I felt like
Right.
I was the only engineer, and these guys could probably dream up things faster than I could go build them. I was hesitant, but ultimately a couple things. I think, one, we were able to come up with a kind of scoped down version of the vision that was manageable. So in the span of, I think 5 weeks, we built our first iteration of the product. And it's different, a little bit different than what you see today. But very quickly we were able to get something and put it out there. Second, it did kind of come down to having somebody to work with because I had some other ideas I was also working on just myself, and I remember building something that I was frankly more excited about. And I was so excited to like launch it. And when I launched it, I realized that this was just the beginning of building a business. Like
Right.
I built a technical thing, but that's not a business. That's just like a product or a proof of concept. And there's so much more that needs to happen in order to turn into a business. I need like employees or business partners. And so suddenly I felt kind of very lonely. And I valued that with AirBed and Breakfast, I had Joe and Brian, people who were equally excited and passionate and, willing to work. That was part of what propelled us,
To
in
say yes.
that first year, even aside from the fact that the idea was crazy, this is what kind of set it apart from, other things that were also on my mind that I was also excited about. Now, you point out like, how did we have confidence in this idea when it was in fact so counterintuitive at the time?
Right.
How can you trust a stranger, in other words? And, it was based on the firsthand experiences that we were having. I mean, of course, that story I just shared from October
Right.
2007 is very compelling, but we had other experiences, shortly thereafter as we launched the product. We didn't have many people use it, but when they did use it, magic did happen quite a lot. And those stories are really powerful. And so it can work. The question is just how to help more people take the leap,
Right.
and embrace meeting somebody new and having this kind of value exchange that makes a lot of sense. That's what we understood that, nobody on the outside really did.
Right. And again, you had a level of conviction that allowed you to basically go to investors, hear a lot of no's, and continue what like designing cereal boxes. Like tell me a little bit. Like, I mean, you had enough stamina to continue.
Honestly, when investors heard the idea, they would have like almost a visceral reaction. Like it wasn't just that like it was a bad idea, it was like a scary idea that was almost revolting. Like they honestly didn't see themselves as customers, right? They're investors, they
Wow.
probably have a fair amount of money. They were not looking to, necessarily save money on a hotel and stay in
Right.
someone's extra bedroom, at least not at that time. So yeah, they would have a pretty strong reaction. Over that first year, no one was willing to invest. No one would even give us a second meeting. And then
Give me a second. Take me there for you, because again, you have other options. I mean, this is anybody that is at your caliber can go anywhere at this phase. Why did you decide to continue, and how did you guys together take those rejections? Because that's not easy.
yeah, and there was other stuff going on that was not easy. For one, actually, during this time, I had moved from San Francisco back to Boston. So suddenly, I was working remotely with my co-founders, and that was to be with my then girlfriend, who had been dating, for a long time, who was now my wife. We've been together for a couple decades now, but it was time to get serious and spend some time together. And so I went back to Boston to be with her, but that obviously strained my
Right.
ability to work with Joe and Brian, and also led to some funny dynamics about just how to handle rejection. Because as the engineer who had a lot of other opportunities, I was very busy with the coding, and I was not going to all the investor pitches. They were doing that out on the West
Right.
Coast while I was on the East Coast working. So I would be eager to hear how the meetings went, and they would always kind of frame it in more positive terms than was probably the actual reality. They were like, "Oh, they thought it was interesting and curious, and they'll get back to us, and they need a little more time." They didn't tell me the part that they were like, that like the investor was
Kicking
like
you
offended
out.
by kicking us out. Yeah. And so, I also remember one time I was in San Francisco during one of these meetings, and we were practicing the night before the pitch deck. And we come to this slide that is basically how much revenue, will we be generating 3 years from now? And the number was 200 million. And I did some quick sanity checks. And I said, like, there's no way we can ramp to 200 million from zero. It just makes no sense. Like 20 million is more realistic. Why don't we put 20 million on the slide? And so Brian's like, yeah, okay, sure. And then the next day we're in the investor meeting, and we come to this slide, and the slides there's not 200 million, not 20 million, but it says 2 billion. So instead of decreasing it, he increased it. It was at that moment in time where the investor totally just like looked out the window and stopped paying attention. And so, afterwards I asked Brian, like, why did you change it? And we had talked about 20 million, and now you changed it to 2 billion. Why'd you do that? And he said, oh, well, I was talking with Sam Altman, OpenAI, Sam Altman. So we knew him way
Right.
back then. He had been in Y Combinator and kind of in our network. And so we got some advice from Sam Altman that investors don't want M's, they want B's, baby. Meaning investors don't want to invest in $1 million opportunities. They want to invest in $1 billion opportunities. And so it's a prerequisite that you have to sell a big idea, which is actually, of course, true. The problem is in our pitch, we didn't really connect the dots between what we were doing and it being $1 billion idea. So I think, both perspectives had some validity to it, but bottom line is the pitch did not go well. And I got to see that firsthand and was definitely very
Ouch.
alarmed by that.
Ouch. So tell me the story about designing cereal boxes with Obama's and Captain McCain's. Is that true?
Yeah, no, it's very true. And so like what led up to that was it's now summer 2008, and we're going to launch the company officially at the Democratic National Convention. This is the event that took place in Denver where Barack Obama received the nomination of his party to be the presidential candidate, a historic event, first African American presidential candidate. The stadium where it's going to be held holds 80,000 people, and we know Denver only has 17,000 people. So we know there's going to be a need for alternative accommodations. And so that's why we, made a whole goal of being ready to
Nice.
launch 2 weeks before then. And, sure enough, it was a big success. Like locals were looking to get out of town. They were putting their stuff up on Craigslist and ultimately then on Airbnb. And we ended up hosting, hundreds of people for this event. And, also the newspapers and blogs and TV were doing stories about the event, of course. And of course, one of the storylines was a historic event, but people have no place to stay. They're like camping out in parks. So, we wrote to the reporters and said, hey, actually, we have 800 confirmed available homes on our platform still available. And they would say, oh, that's an interesting story. I'm going to feature you. Because we rode the media wave, right? We didn't create the story. The story was out there already about the event. And we made we made our product relevant to that event. And so that's a great strategy in general for getting media attention, right? Like you can't make the wave, but you can ride the wave. So you just got to identify the wave and make yourself relevant to it. So that's what we did very successfully. And we were on, CNN and, just getting amazing coverage. And we
Amazing.
sold hundreds of bookings. Now, a week later, the convention's over and nobody cares about us anymore, right? Like there's zero business.
Right.
And so this got us thinking, we had met all these reporters during the previous week, and now they didn't care about us anymore. But how could we get back in touch with them and make ourselves relevant to them and get featured again? Because that was so amazing. So I don't know how it happened, but basically Joe and Brian got this idea to create a presidentially themed breakfast cereal. And it was partially because the name of our company was AirBed and Breakfast. And so, obviously the product is AirBeds, but they thought it'd be funny to do something with the breakfast
Cereal.
concept. That was also part of the name at the time. We weren't Airbnb yet. We were still AirBed and Breakfast. And they said we should create a presidentially themed breakfast cereal. And then we
Amazing.
should mail these physical boxes to all the reporters. And if they get a box of our presidential cereal, they'll be so curious, they'll call us back and we'll start talking to them again. They come and tell me the story, and I just think it's ridiculous. And I said, guys, do whatever you want, but just promise me that you won't spend any money. I was like heads down writing code, and I had a
Right.
backlog of things I needed to do. And I said, oh, you guys can spend your time doing that, but just don't spend any money. So to their credit, they were super scrappy. They didn't spend any money. They got friends and people in their network to help print off the boxes, and being artists themselves, they were able to create amazing artwork for these boxes and super witty concepts,
Amazing.
and hot glued all these boxes together, stuffed them with cereal. And so they're super scrappy, and they made it. In the span of like a month and a half, they made presidentially themed breakfast cereal. Obama's tagline was "Hope in every bowl," and Captain McCain's "The Maverick in every bite." And so the first 100 of each of these boxes they mailed in the physical mail to the reporters, and then the extra boxes that they had printed, they decided to label as a limited edition collector's item. So they numbered each one 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 400, and we made a little website to sell them on. So anyways, the reporters get these boxes, and sure enough, this is in the lead up to the election, so there's obviously a whole hysteria about the election and
Right.
excitement and people doing wacky things. And so like we're an example of a wacky thing that's going on. So sure enough, like we get back on CNN and Good Morning America talking about the breakfast cereal, talking about AirBed and Breakfast, what this is all about. And that day we become the #1 political video of the day on CNN. And we sell a
Wow.
$40 box of our cereal, the limited edition collector's item, on our website, $40 a box. We sold a box of cereal every 3 minutes until we sold out. So that
Wow.
week we made like over $30,000. We sold out of Obama O's. We never sold out of Captain McCain. So I guess we could have predicted the election. It was so exciting. And like we made more money that week than we had all year in our core business. And we thought, well,
Incredible.
if only there was a presidential election every week, we could just be making cereals. But clearly that wasn't a repeatable strategy. And once that passed, we were kind of once again kind of back at square one
Back.
with like making no money. A whole year has gone by and we're asking ourselves, when do you quit? 12 months in, made no money except this, kind of
Cereal
hoax,
boxes.
kind of not hoax, but like a fad thing, PR stunt. But our actual business isn't making any money. It's not growing despite all the work we're doing. And, we are having trouble paying our rent again. When do you quit? When do you quit? And so,
When do you quit, Nathan? Because again, this is when, you actually went to Y Combinator and things started changing. But when do you quit? Why continue?
yeah, well, I mentioned, earlier, like, starting a business with other people is kind of like a professional marriage and like they often
Yeah.
fall apart. And so, choosing your founders is really important. And also part of that is making sure you're kind of like in the same stage of life too, right? We are obviously young guys. I had a girlfriend, but in a
Right.
serious one, but we didn't have kids yet. And,
Right.
we were able to take risk. And
Right.
so, we had made it this far and that was pretty great. But, we were all getting a little desperate. And because we were all friends with one another before doing this, we really didn't want to quit and leave the other guys hanging. Like we
Right.
kind of needed to decide this together. No one person wanted to jump ship. So we made an agreement. We said, we've worked really hard this year. We need to give it one more shot. And we need to give it our absolute all. The truth is, like, I had been doing some consulting on the side. I had been in Boston. Like, they had also some side projects. So like, we weren't completely focused. And we agreed that we were going to apply to Y Combinator, which is a well-known accelerator program even back then. And that if we got in, we would do it, yeah, of course. And the thing about Y Combinator is it's about a 12-week program, and so it's very finite. And we said we're going to do Y Combinator if we get in. At the end of the 12 weeks, if the company is in a materially better place, we'll all quit together and not have any hard feelings about it. Like we'll just pre-agree up front that
Wow.
that's the condition for quitting. We'll see how it goes. But before we could do Y Combinator, we had to get into Y Combinator. And this in itself is a pretty interesting story and a lesson. It's very selective, Y Combinator,
Oh yeah.
even back then. So we did a lot of practicing and rehearsing and like practice like stressful interviews, like where we were shouting questions at each other and like throwing phone books around the room and just trying to like make sure that we could stay on point, even in a stressful situation. So we did a lot of preparation and we go to the interview, and the interview is only 5 minutes. It's super fast. 2 minutes into the interview, Paul Graham is like, "What? Strangers staying in other people's houses?" It's like, I would never do that. Like he had the same reaction that everyone else did. He did not like the idea. He was almost like angry about the idea. And at that point, the conversation goes sideways, and he kind of says, "You know what? I really don't like that idea, but you are handling payments between guests and hosts, and so maybe you should become a payments company." So he basically takes the next 3 minutes to try to convince us to do a different idea, which sounded a lot like what Stripe eventually became, actually,
Right.
which is kind of funny. We're 5 minutes is up, and we're walking out of the room, realizing we had blown it, right? Like we
Wow.
completely like went off the rails here. And as we're going out, um, Joe takes out of his bag a box of the Obamos. And it's funny because before we had left for the interview, I saw Joe putting the Obamos in his bag. And I said, "Joe, don't bring that to the interview." Because for me, the Obamos and that whole cereal story I just told you about, to me, it represented a distraction. Although it was
Right.
like super clever and made 30,000 bucks, it obviously did nothing to drive our core business. And it took about like a month and a half of like Joe Bryan's time. And so I felt like that did not really communicate that we were like a serious tech company and focused. But Joe brought the Obama anyways. And as we're walking out, he takes it out of his bag and gives it to Paul Graham. And Paul Graham
Shows
says,
resilience.
"Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah." But Paul Graham looks at it and he says, "What is this? Did you buy me a gift? What is this?" And Joe said, "No, we made this." And Paul Graham's looking at it, he's like, "I don't understand. You made this?" He's like, "Come back in and tell me how you made this." So we sit down and we get 5 more minutes with PG, and we tell him how we made the cereal. And later that day, we got a call saying that we were accepted into Y Combinator. And later on, Paul Graham told us that we were accepted not because he liked our idea, he hated our idea, but he knows that the ideas can change.
Right.
And, instead he's really, choosing people based on, the founders and who he thinks will have the tenacity, the perseverance, and the ability to create and build. And so from that story, what he saw was that these are guys who would not give up. They would
Right.
be very resourceful and scrappy and figure out a way to do things. And so,
Incredible.
that met his criteria for admitting us. And I think, it's also just a lesson for anybody when it comes to pitching yourself. The idea is one part of it, but it's also, all about you and your character.
I absolutely love this story because, again, at the end of the day, the ups and downs are insane, especially the downs. So being able to continue, I think that's the big thing that Y Combinator is trying to figure out, right? Like, are you going to be the founders that will continue? And I think they also gave you some ideas around being closer to your customers, right? Like eventually in Y Combinator and going more towards New York. Can you share a little bit about like some of these big learnings that you had in Y Combinator and how did that shape Airbnb as a whole?
We heard a lot of advice, during Y Combinator and from other people too, but especially during Y Combinator and from Paul Graham. He always has interesting things to say. And the thing I'll say about advice is obviously not all advice is good advice. Like there's all kinds of
No.
advice, but advice is thought provoking. Amongst all this advice we were getting, there were some real nuggets that we latched onto and thought about.
Actually, let's go there just for a second, for a second, because I think with advice, it's actually really complicated because the grass sometimes always looks greener on the other side. And if somebody really smart tells you, go this route, like you might find yourself, and I see founders do that, right? Like they just start going all around. How did you continue your North Star and know what to take from which advice?
I think it's not about like necessarily following advice because some of it's good, some of it's bad. It's about reflecting at the end of the day. Advice causes you to reflect. Is this true? Is it not? Is this a good idea? Is it not? It's a
Right.
stimulus. It's an outside stimulus. It sparks creativity. And this is important because when you're starting something, so many people are secretive about what they're doing. They don't
Right.
want someone to steal their idea,
I've
and
heard that.
so it
Yeah.
leads you to like not share. And I think it's a missed opportunity because it's important to hear different perspectives, get different, reactions, and then reflect on that. And I felt that every time we engaged someone about what we were working on, we came away with new thoughts that we wouldn't have otherwise had. And we made a point to go to every single office hours that Y Combinator held, and we were always the first ones there. Spent the most time with Paul Graham just because we wanted to hear his reactions. Even though he didn't necessarily like our idea at first, we
Right.
still wanted to talk with him and understand that and unpack that and get new ideas. So, anyways, one of the things that gets said is that it's better to have 100 users that love you than a million users that kind of like you, right? Like you need to
Right.
have evangelists, people who feel really passionate about what you do. And then also like to do that, you kind of need to meet your users, right? Like you need to deeply understand their needs and how they're using your product. And both those things are a little counterintuitive, at least for us at the time, because we thought we were building an internet company and, internet companies are built for
Right.
scale. And if you're doing scale, of course, you can't go meet your users individually.
Right.
And it's all about bigger numbers. And so these ideas kind of led us to think more about product market fit and actually spend time meeting users. And so that's what we did based on that feedback. And Paul Graham said, well, where are your users? Why aren't you meeting them? We said, well, like our platform, people are based all around the world. And there's not many here in San Francisco. Actually, most of them are in New York. He's like, well, why don't you go to New York? We're like, well, we're here doing Y Combinator and we don't have any money. He's like, I don't care. Go to New York. And so, Joe and Brian, like back then when you did Y Combinator, you got $20,000. That's it. It wasn't like 100,000 or 200,000 like they do
Right.
now. Like they do big numbers now, but back then it was $20,000. So we used much of the $20,000 going to New York for a few different weekends. And when we went to New York, we realized that a lot of people had photos of their homes. Well, some had no photos, and others had photos, but they were poorly lit. They were poor resolution, especially back then. Camera phones weren't very good. And how do you meet your users when you're an internet company? We would call them up and we'd say, "Hey, we saw that you put your apartment on Airbnb. Would you like a professional photographer to come to your house and like take some professional photos of it for your listing or whatever other purpose you might like. And I think people were a little surprised to get this like offer out of the
Right.
blue, but a lot of them said yes to that offer. They were curious and they fine, yeah, sure, that's a great deal, free. So, knock knock on the door, and it was actually Joe and Ryan themselves showing up.
Did they know that it's the CEO that is coming to
No,
take
no,
photos?
no, not until they showed up. And we didn't have any money. They didn't own an expensive camera, but they would actually rent a camera on the weekends just for this purpose. And they'd go and they'd take the photos, but while they're with the host, they would also sit down at the computer and like watch them use the product and get ideas from them, give them tutorials, and then also invite them to get a beer later on. And so we get a few hosts together later on for beer. And over beers, we would tell them our entrepreneurial journey, the stories that I'm sharing now. And people do
Amazing.
love those stories. They love a good story. And this was a way in which we started to build rapport with our early
Right.
community and develop a following of people who loved Airbnb. At this point now in New York, we have good photos on the properties. We've met the hosts and built a rapport. And with that rapport, we're able to call them up and say, you know what, that price you set, would you mind lowering it? If you get too much interest, you can always increase it. But we think like starting
Right.
at $400 a night feels a little too high at
Wow.
this point. You don't have any reviews yet. So could you start it low and raise it up later? And if you had asked someone out of the blue to do that, they would say like, who are you to suggest that? And no.
Right.
But because they had met us and they liked us, they said, yeah, sure, we would love to help you out. And so, now we
Yeah.
have well photographed properties at attractive prices in New York City, a place that people all around the world want to go to, but it's, really expensive. And these properties start getting bookings. The hosts start making money and they tell their friends, and their friends come to the site and they see the effort that the other hosts have put in, and they look to emulate that because that's the recipe for success. And so we get more and more hosts in New York. Meanwhile, these guests from around the world who are coming to New York are flying back home, and they're thinking to themselves, hey, that's cool. Maybe I could be a host in my own home city, in Paris, in Berlin. And
Right.
so very quickly, there's a cross pollination happening. And, this is when things started to take off. And like I mentioned earlier, Y Combinator was about 12 or 13-week program. And we had agreed at the start of it that if things didn't materially improve, we would quit at the end of 13 weeks. So before Y Combinator, we were making $200 a week in revenue. And that had been true for 5 months. Nothing we did seemed to increase it. Our goal during Y Combinator was to get to $1,000 a week. And literally in the span of 13 weeks, we got to $4,200 a week. So passed our
Wow.
goal quite a lot more than $200 a week. We are also during this time introduced to Sequoia Capital, one of the best investors in the world. And we ended that 13-week period not only with a great ramp in revenue, but Sequoia Capital investing $600,000 in our seed round, leading that round at a paltry $3 million post-money valuation, which is funny, and
You
it doesn't
made
even seem
so
real
much
by today's
money. Oh my
standards.
God.
But back then, this was during the recession, the financial
Incredible.
recession in 2009. So
True.
this is the kind of valuations that were out there. But we were stoked.
Right.
Now we had our first investor, and before, every investor had basically laughed at us and not taken a second meeting. And now here's Sequoia Capital, one of the best names in the world, investing in us. And so that was a huge boost in confidence,
Huge.
and it meant we never had to have that conversation about quitting. And from there forward, it was a rocket ship. So from March, April 2009 onwards, began that more positive part of the story because that first year was so painful.
And at that point, are you trying basically, I mean, you as, CTO and then chief strategy officer, then you're leading international expansion. Is that kind of when you're starting to move from New York only to starting to expand? Because you also expanded to really complicated markets like China and like, is that kind of when this is starting to happen? I mean, after it stabilized?
I mean, a lot of years, have
In
happened since
between, I guess.
2009.
Yeah.
So there's a sequencing to it, right? So 2009 was really defined by our growth in New York City, and then also just starting to build a team, right? So it was still just the three of us, and I was the only engineer until basically August of 2009. So that's now 18 months after
Wow.
having started. And at this point, the company's doing really, really well. It's, I think, making like $12,000 a week by August. So it continued to ramp. We hire our first engineer, besides myself. That's August 2009. By 2010, We are now growing in, like, let's say Paris, Los Angeles, let's say 4 or 5 cities are now,
Yeah.
you know, thriving. So still small. And then comes 2011. 2011 was another inflection point where just everything happened all at once. So what kicked it off was competition. Up until that point, we had been very quiet about our success. And even when we fundraised money, we didn't announce our fundraisings because we didn't want to tip off other people that this was a good idea. And so we kept it to ourselves, and we would share it, but we basically staggered the news by 4 or 5 months. By the start of 2011, or let's say late 2010, word of our Series A funding, which had happened in April 2010, had gotten out. So by the end of 2010, that happened. So it was like 5 months staggered. And our Series A funding was a $7 million raise at like roughly, I think, a $72 million post
Wow.
money valuation, something like that.
That is so
And
fast. Yeah.
that got the attention of people, and specifically some serial entrepreneurs based in Europe who are, well known for cloning successful Silicon Valley companies, including the Samwar brothers, who have a company called Rocket Internet that famously cloned Groupon and attempted to clone Facebook,
Wow.
and basically every company they try to clone, and they decided to try to clone Airbnb and become the Airbnb of Europe, as does another serial entrepreneur based in Europe. So suddenly we see competition. We know that travel is inherently global. We know that to be a relevant travel company, you need to
Right.
be in Europe too. Like, that's like a very important part of the travel jigsaw puzzle. So, we become determined to be, just as local as these guys. I guess before we do that though, like they come to us and say, look, if we work together, if you acquire us, like we can combine our strengths and our skill sets and, like, definitely be a global company. We entertained it. We had to. I mean, we had a fiduciary duty to at
Right.
least consider this offer. And it was totally shocking because at this point we have 40 employees. And I remember flying to Berlin, touring their offices, and they have like 200 employees in their office. And they had just started. And partially
Wow.
that's because they had like a pool of people, working at other companies that they could pull from, and basically bootstrap this new company overnight. But it's super intimidating to see all those people, so many more than we had. Ultimately, though, we realized like these guys are a little bit kind of like mercenaries, is what we call them. Like, and we viewed ourselves as missionaries. Like, we really loved the business we were
Mm.
in. We were really attached to it. We lived the product. And we felt that our competitors were out to make a quick buck, and so that didn't appeal to us. And so we declined the offer, but we realized we needed a plan B. We needed to get into growth mode and go from like
Mhm.
what I'll call peacetime to wartime, like, not just like going along the lazy river, but like really start sprinting. We need to be more local than these European companies.
How do you make those decisions? Like this is a new type of decisions for you. I guess everything is new for you, but I mean, these are type of like these are big decisions. Who helps you? Is that Sequoia? Is that someone else? Like, how do you
Yeah,
make those decisions?
they're big decisions, and we definitely, going back to like the idea of getting advice, we would always reach out to different mentors to get their perspective and call other founders and get their perspective. But,
Right.
specifically in this case, yes, you're right. Like our partner at Sequoia, the original partner, his name was Greg McAdoo. We would at that time get brunch with him every 2 weeks and just tell him what was going on with the company. So he was like, spending a lot of time with us, just being a thought partner.
Amazing.
But for this trip, he came with us. He saw everything we saw, and we had conversations about it. And together we made the decision of like, we're actually going to turn down this offer that, on the one hand, felt like it would lead to obvious success because these guys were
Right.
so experienced operationally, and they had so many people, and they had Europe, to going it alone, which felt very risky. But we made that big decision, and quickly through our network started, reaching out to people who had helped other companies to scale internationally. And, in the
Mm.
span of a couple months, hired country managers for, 8 to 12 countries, and opened offices in those countries, and hired local teams. When I say local teams, maybe a dozen people to basically, bootstrap the market, and get
Incredible.
super hands-on and meet the hosts, like I told you before, we did in New York, and photograph the properties and all this hands-on stuff that is necessary when attracting your first users and building your initial credibility.
Unbelievable. So you guys are starting to expand all over Europe and again, other countries then at this point, including complicated ones. I don't know if we're going to go into exactly how, but I mean, some places like China are a whole different gambit of things, right? Because a lot of things are just not allowed there. I don't know if you want to go over a little bit, but then I do want to go to 2020 at some point. So,
Yeah, I mean, there's a sequencing here. So like this competition kind of kicks off in 2011, and I'd say 2011, 2012 was really defined by, this race to win Europe specifically. And, we were also starting to plant the seed in Asia too, simultaneously, but Europe was the initial focus. But by like 2014, 2015, having, managed to have success in most of the other markets, if not all the other markets, we also started to explore China, which was a whole adventure in itself.
probably a
You know,
show
but
of its own. Yeah.
yeah, a very unique market because
Yeah.
of how big the ecosystem is and because of the government and all these different things. But we are incredibly popular in China amongst travelers. We used to think like, will this only work in New York? Will this only work in North America? Everywhere we went, people said,
Right.
okay, that might work where you're coming from, but this will never work in my country. And it's just so amazing to see that not
It
be
actually
true and
does.
to see it actually work in every country of the world. All around the world, people have a curiosity to meet people from other places, especially other countries, and see how other people live. And so we tapped into that in a way that was also affordable. And so,
Right.
yeah, I think it's been remarkable to me to see how, we are now ubiquitous for home sharing in every country of the world. It works in every country of the world where we're allowed to operate.
Yeah.
And, more than 2 billion people have now stayed in other people's homes. So like, this idea of strangers is no longer.
It's interesting because we got to know you guys roughly around 2007. 2007, my son was born. After that, my daughter. And at that point, it's like, I'm not going to have two babies in a second room or in a hotel. And, I think at that 2010 or whatever, we started staying in Airbnbs. I mean, it's
Yeah,
like
it's great for families.
it was a must for families. Like I actually don't know what families do without it. Like if
Yeah.
I'm being really honest. So we were very, very early. So I could see which countries are already on Airbnb, which are not, because we were big travelers. And it was really interesting as a family. Like I literally don't know what families do, which was kind of a whole different story. So take me back in time to 2020.
Yeah.
What did that look like? Again, these are you guys in the like exactly where the hospitality is, travel is, like you're right there in COVID hits.
Right. Well, going into 2020, we're now coming on like at that point 12 years of growth and building the business and had tons of success. And we were planning for our IPO in early
IPO.
2020. And so, in 2019 already, we had written, the draft S1 and done all this preparation. 2020 comes and we're, planning to do this. And then COVID happens, and in early March, WHO declares, a pandemic. And our business drops 80% in just 8 weeks. I mean, it just disappears. That's super
Mhm.
scary because like at this point we have, I think, 8,000 employees, maybe a little more. We're a big ship. We have a big expensive burn rate. The costs don't stop. The revenues
No.
stop, but the costs are there.
And probably people are asking for refunds or I don't know, like how did you cope with that? Like take me there.
A lot was happening all at once, right? Like obviously travel was deeply impacted. That's why no more new bookings were coming in, but also we had existing bookings. Guests were wanting to cancel, and that what might not have been acceptable by the host cancellation policy. So there's billions of dollars of bookings,
Right.
that had to be sorted out in terms of whether to honor the booking or not and how to navigate that. So
Right.
that's complicated. There's just a burn rate situation. And the issue there is not just that there's no money coming in, but we don't know how long this is going to go on for, right? Like, is this a 2 week thing, a 2 month thing, a 2 year
Nobody knew
thing? Like,
anything. Yeah.
right? So like in terms of planning how long your bank account's going to last, we had no idea. We knew we had to raise some money quick, but of course, this is exactly when the market, basically froze up and,
Right.
no one was willing to give you money at this point.
Because nobody knew anything, right? I mean, it's like so
Right. Everybody needed money all of a sudden.
yeah, yeah.
And so it's a terrible time to raise money. And we have to make basically a bunch of choices. And I think a couple things. One is, we realized right away it's a crisis. This was not like something to be managed away or kind of like not buy a little time. Like we said, we're going to treat this super serious, like from the get go. We're going to be bold. we're not going to take half measures. So,
Right.
we had to first right size the ship a little bit into financially.
Right.
We did a layoff relatively quickly. One of the worst days that, I've had to
Really.
experience. We lost 1,800 employees, but it was necessary to
Right.
to do that quickly, or else everything was in jeopardy.
Right.
And we did that with a lot of humanity too. We found ways to help employees. Like on the one hand, we needed to help the company. The company was in jeopardy, but we also understood, people also were going through their own situations during this pandemic. And so, we found creative ways to help people find new jobs at other tech companies. We created a whole directory that people could opt into,
Right.
and we shipped off those names to other companies that were hiring because, some companies were actually doing well during the pandemic. We helped
That's
people
amazing.
transition and find new jobs, but we also went out and we raised some more money on, terms that were tough, but ultimately, necessary and, great.
Can I take you to a personal question? Like at that point, when you go to sleep at night, do you know it's going to be okay or are you terrified? Like, where is it taking you?
It's definitely a scary thing, for sure, because there's so much uncertainty and there's so much at stake, and, everything you thought you had accomplished, is
Right.
suddenly poof, like gone faster than you thought was possible, or feeling like it could be gone. And so, super scary. At the same time, I think we all got into kind of the wartime mentality, which is like, we're going to buckle down and get super
Right.
focused, super disciplined. We're going to operate differently, right? We're not going to operate the way we were weeks ago. We're going to meet as an executive team every single day to discuss the status of everything. We're going to get really clear on tracks of work, ownership. We're going to make decisions quickly. We're going to act with boldness. We came up with principles that were going to kind of guide, our decision making. We moved incredibly fast to deal with the situation. And then, something we've learned along the way is that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. There's a quote from Andy Grove,
Nice.
the former Intel CEO, that we really liked, which is like, bad companies are destroyed by crisis, good companies survive them, and great companies effectively thrive or come out
Right.
stronger from a crisis. And so we had experienced this before in earlier years where, what started off as a crisis was actually a little bit of a call to action that we ultimately not only survived, but came out stronger because of, and came out as a better company. And so as
Right.
we quickly identified that this was a crisis, we were also trying to understand, how can we come out stronger as a
What
result?
is the
And so,
lesson? Yeah.
as we were having to cut down on our projects because we had fewer people, we got really clear about like what was important in the long term and not to sacrifice those things. And we also thought to ourselves, like, in this pandemic, it turns out people still wanted to travel. They couldn't get on airplanes. They couldn't go to other countries, but they wanted to go out to the countryside and they wanted to have a home where they could socially isolate, maybe with some other family members and make a little bubble or whatnot. So we
Right.
realized that like the desire was still there. It's now just taking a different form. And so we became very agile and adapting our product to, help people, find these opportunities and, travel in this new way. And so, actually very quickly, within let's say 2 or 4 months, we stabilized our business and started growing again by, meeting some of these new
Incredible.
consumer behaviors, through our agility. And actually, by the end of 2020, we completed our IPO. So that IPO that was supposed to happen in,
Terrific.
let's say, March, and instead a pandemic happened, and instead we thought the company was about to implode, we stabilized it, returned to growth, and then, followed through on the IPO by the end of the year, quite successfully. And so, it was a remarkable turnaround in the span of, 12 months.
It's absolutely incredible. Like I remember even thinking, like, how is it possible that Airbnb not only that it's not sinking with this crisis, like it's actually like IPO. I mean, it was just incredible. And I think a lot of the experiences and the services that you have now, kind of started flourishing, if I'm not mistaken, during this time, right? And again, right now you're expanding into experiences and doing all these things in such a bigger way. Was that kind of the accelerator? And how is that these offerings starting to evaluate, kind of shaping the future of travel, you think, right now?
Yeah, so, we've gotten to a place now, it's 2025, it's, 5 years after the start of the
Right.
pandemic, and, certainly 3 years since, the pandemic was dominating our attention. And the pandemic caused us to put a lot of things on hold because we had to get more focused. We had to get focused on our core business again. And, so a lot of things that we believed in, were paused. And, one of those things that we had at the time was experiences. And it's not that we stopped offering them, but we weren't leaning into it as much during the
Mm,
pandemic because, I mean, look, people were socially isolating. They weren't getting together in
right.
person. So that product offering kind of, I don't want to say stalled, but, it grew more slowly during the pandemic and subsequent. And, we recently relaunched experiences and also added to it with something we call services. And services are basically thinking about all the conveniences that you could find in a hotel and making sure that those things are available to you when you rent a home. So, if you want a personal trainer or a spa or a chef, how can we
Right.
connect you to one of those people who can do that for you in your home, even when you're in a foreign city, for example, and you don't know who to call and don't speak the language? And how can we make this just as easy to book as a home, all through the app?
Right.
And so that we, relaunched experiences and we launched services with a completely new app integration. And, that's been really exciting to be in a place where, we can start to innovate and expand, into other aspects of travel,
Incredible.
because I think there's so much more we can do. And as we think about growing our business, we always think about like, well, like what can Airbnb uniquely do, and how can we leverage our host community and work with our host community to empower people to, provide travel services in new ways. And so I think experiences is a great embodiment of that.
Amazing. What do you think the travel of the future holds? Is it a lot around community and experiences? Is that kind of the big focus, you think, or is it something else?
I think since the beginning, we realized that the magic is in the people, right? Like that story
Yeah.
from October 2007 when Joe and Brian hosted those three in their
Right.
apartment. Like it wasn't just about the affordable place to stay. Obviously, it started with that, right? But it ended with friendship. It ended with like
Right.
Joe and Brian being invited to this guy from India, his wedding, like 2 years
That's
later,
so cool.
So it was pretty powerful on a personal level. I think travel at its best, transforms your perspective and makes the world a smaller place and creates friendships that cross borders. That's the future and vision we're excited about, trying
Right.
to create. And we do that through a product that, creates, first trust. It's a framework for
Right.
how you can establish trust with someone you don't know, through their reputation, through how we handle the money, through the various protections. But I also think about inspiration too. And, we have a lot of inspiring spaces that are super fun and, like you never knew these things existed and suddenly you realize on Airbnb they do, and that's inspiring. But, I think likewise with the experiences product, right? Like it's a whole new travel
Right.
offering that's, very different from, let's say, the tourist bus that, has traditionally been available to show you
Oh.
around town. And so I think we
Yeah.
we 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 think there's so many different ways in which we can reinvent the travel offering and open up new destinations that weren't previously on the map, maybe because they had no infrastructure, maybe they had no hotels. But I think,
Mm,
through the lens of a local, you can really unlock what's special about the place and make something,
right.
into an experience that wasn't previously. And so, yeah, this is what excites us. And we think there's a lot of new ways to continue to do that.
Amazing. And so, I mean, based on everything you know now, Nathan, and you guys built like such an extraordinary company and unbelievable value across so many countries. What would you want to tell yourself when you were younger, like based on everything that you know now? What were some of the biggest lesson or things that you wish somebody told you?
I was often preoccupied with opportunity cost. I mentioned it earlier a little bit,
Yeah.
but like this idea that there's so many opportunities and like, what if I miss out on
Right.
an opportunity? It can be a little paralyzing, like which direction do I go in? And
Right.
I shared a little bit of the criteria, and there's some more things too. One is I think as long as each experience or direction you go in is challenging and you learn, then it's just one step in a journey. It's not necessarily your final outcome. It's building your skill set for that ultimate thing that you do.
Right.
And so I did a lot of things that were frankly not successful, like a lot of side projects. I didn't mention them here, but in retrospect, all those things that I did that were ended up being, from one perspective, a waste of time because they didn't work out as I anticipated, were actually super valuable, like skill building opportunities.
Right.
Um, so that's one. And a funny thing is like, yeah, was at Harvard, and Mark Zuckerberg is a year younger than me. He was at Harvard too. And I remember that first summer when he started the Facebook, put an ad out, on the computer science listserv saying, who wants to join me and go to Palo Alto to work on this thing? And I told my roommate, that sounds kind of cool. Maybe I'll apply. And my roommate was like, no, that sounds stupid. Don't do that. And I was like, yeah, you're right. That sounds like not like a serious thing. So I didn't. And so then, a year or two goes by and I'm like really kicking myself. I'm like, I could have been like one of the Facebook co-founders, had I gone to Palo
Right.
Alto and not listened to my roommate, and then, fast forward a few years and I have some friends working at Facebook and they invite me to lunch and tell me what they're working on a little bit and try to convince me to join. And like at this point, they have like 40 engineers. And I'm like, I don't know, you guys are so big already. Like already you're using all the colleges and high schools. Like what more is there to do? Like you guys are done.
Right.
You're mature as a company. And obviously that was not the case. They were still just getting started. And so again, I was kicking myself for like not going down that path. And yet, had I gone down that path, I wouldn't have done Airbnb. And so I think,
Right.
look, there's many right paths. I think the important thing, you can always course correct. And as long as you're learning on whatever path you're on, you're building your skill set to that ultimate thing. There's this article in the New York Times I read a number of years ago about like the nature of luck. And, what it says is like, luck is like two things. I mean, there's of course some serendipity to it, but it's also happening, like there's opportunity around you all the time. You just have to notice it, right? And
Right.
so yes, of course there's serendipity, like me finding Joe on Craigslist, there's some serendipity there, or the other roommate falling through, that's some serendipity. But there's
Right.
also moments where we saw opportunity. For example, like applying to Y Combinator and this getting the cereal out. Like,
Right.
Joe recognized a moment to make an impression right at the right moment. And so I think you can train yourself to notice opportunity that is right before you. And I think we're all surrounded by opportunities. We just fail to notice it. And so I think that's a really kind of important lesson that would have put me at ease as a younger person when I was like so preoccupied with like how do I become successful? Like which is the right path? It's like just, don't worry. Like actually any of these could be right paths. Just do one thing at a time, learn, move on when you stop learning and be observant. Be observant to what's happening around you so that you're ready to pounce when the right one
Amazing.
comes across your desk or in front of you.
And create your own luck, which you guys are doing again and again and again, which
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
so beautiful. Yeah. Oh my God, Nathan, this is so good. I can talk to you probably for many, many more hours about leadership or whatever, but seriously, thank you for everything you guys are doing and for changing the world and, just this incredible episode that I know is just pure gold. Thank you.
It's a lot of fun for me too. So thanks for taking the time to have me on your program. I really enjoyed it.
More episodes that you're going to love are right around the corner, so definitely make sure to click the like button and subscribe to our channel. Also, who in your life should see this today? Do share this with them. This will inspire and help those you care about and helps us continue to bring amazing guests. And I will see you there.